right, I remembered to start the recording all by myself today. Okay, it is 10 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. This will be the last lecture of the year for ecology. And yeah, it's all about applied ecology. So yeah, I've got this subcaption here, how can we use our powers for good? Us as informed citizens, what are some of the things that we can do to kind of benefit society, help ameliorate some of the problems that humans are causing in ecosystems. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about jobs and stuff as well, but it'll be mostly conceptual about especially conservation biology this lecture. Okay, but yeah, ecology as a science does have a bunch of applications, a bunch of ways that it's useful um, to human societies, and so I want to talk a little bit about that here. So yeah, here are just some applications of ecology as a science. So some of these we've already sort of been through in class. So for example, studying disease dynamics with population models and that kind of thing. That's certainly one aspect of ecology that's directly applicable to human systems with epidemiology. Studying the effects of climate change. So that's a big current thrust, is trying to understand uh, all of the complexities about this huge global issue, climate change, and what sorts of effects it might have in the long run. We'll talk a little bit more about climate change today as well. We've kind of skirted around climate change. We've mentioned it here and there, but I want to just make sure that everyone understands kind of the evidence for climate change and that kind of thing too. And so we'll sort of talk about that a little bit as well today. Some other applications of ecology, we've got wildlife management. So yeah, studying any sort of species that humans are dependent on. So things like, like game species, like deer populations and that kind of thing. Studying the best practices for just maintaining the goods that we're getting from natural ecosystems. That's the field of wildlife management. And also management of other ecosystem services here. So in addition to food, other things that we're getting from natural ecosystems, things that we talked about last week. That's another thing that ecologists do. So for example, people who are studying or people who are interested in maximizing the amount of paper that we can produce. So yeah, we want to make a bunch of paper, maybe a bunch of toilet paper for people who are going crazy and buying it in the stores, even though they don't need that much. But yeah, if you want to maximize your yield, maximize the number of trees that you can grow, that's a question of ecological productivity. And ecologists, like these paper mills companies, the companies who are growing trees and harvesting trees, they're hiring ecologists to try to figure out what sorts of things they can do to maximize the production of trees, and therefore maximize the production of paper and that kind of thing. So yeah, you can do this for pretty much any ecosystem function, any ecosystem service. Is going to have some ecological sorts of applications that an ecologist might be particularly suited to managing those sort of services. And finally, we have the field of conservation biology. This is all about maintaining biodiversity of ecosystems. So this includes subfields like restoration ecology, trying to restore biodiversity or ecosystems to what they once were in the past. Mitigating disturbance, controlling invasive species, these all kind of fall under the conservation biology umbrella. And yeah, so that's a big application for ecology, is this conservation biology, which we'll talk a little bit more about today as well. Before we do that, I wanted just to mention some of the kinds of jobs that you can get as an ecologist. So if you're interested in pursuing ecology as a career, these are some of the things that you might try to look into. First of all, there's just straight up academia. This is what a lot of ecologists end up doing. They get trained as ecologists and then they just keep doing research as part of a university or something like that. And they're writing scientific papers and contributing to the field as a whole by, adding novel contributions with the research that they're doing. And those jobs typically also involve teaching at these universities as well. So yeah, that's certainly one avenue to explore if you're interested in ecology type jobs. You could also get a governmental job. So there are tons of like wildlife management jobs and even sort of like natural history tour guide type jobs with governmental organizations, things like Texas Parks and Wildlife, City of Austin, National Parks, and that kind of thing. Those kind of jobs tend to be pretty stable and have pretty good benefits if you want those kinds of things. So yeah, that's another avenue to maybe look into. There's also non-government organizations, NGOs, that employ ecologists as well, things like the Nature Conservancy, Center for Environmental Research and Conservation, that kind of thing. And these people are typically doing a lot of research, a lot of kind of administration, a lot of grant writing, that kind of thing, trying to maximize conservation outcomes, so maximize biodiversity in different locations and that kind of thing. There are also research scientists and research assistants that are employed by various other organizations, including a lot in the private sector. So a lot of like pest control companies and agricultural companies, things like Monsanto and that kind of thing, they're employing ecologists as research scientists to, again, try to do things like maximize productivity, minimize the impacts of invasive species, explore the effects of different chemicals on the environment. So for example, pest control companies, they're developing all these different pesticides, and they're employing ecologists to test those pesticides to try to figure out what sorts of issues they might cause in the environment and that kind of thing. Also working in a museum, that would be another sort of research position, describing new species and that kind of thing based on museum collections. And yeah, that's another thing that you could do. I had a buddy who was working in a museum as an ecologist. He was studying feeding relationships with lizards, like trying to figure out lizard diets and what sorts of connections they have to the other species in the ecosystem. And rather than going out into the ecosystem and looking at lizards and what they're eating, he was working in a museum and just cutting the lizards open and looking at their stomach contents and IDing it. So, yeah, some of these ecology jobs actually don't involve field work. You could get a desk job as an ecologist too. And then finally, environmental consulting and environmental policy. These are other sorts of jobs that that ecologists would be, particularly adept for, performing the duties of those jobs. So environmental consulting, a lot of times that is going out into the field and make sure people are following any sort of conservation laws and that kind of thing. So for example, a construction company might hire an ecologist as an environmental consultant to make sure that they're not impacting things like water quality or things like cave species here in Austin. That's an important one. So there's like all these karst, people who study karst invertebrates and that kind of thing. They go out and do surveys looking for these little spiders and things that live in caves to make sure that any sort of construction isn't wiping out some of these rare cave species and that kind of thing. And then policy jobs. So there's all sorts of jobs in, again, mostly governmental jobs where you're kind of, as an ecologist, you kind of understand the principles and you're applying those to law and to, making sure that the laws are reflective of what good science, basically. All right, so those are just some of the jobs that you can get as an ecologist. I mentioned that conservation biology is a big application of ecology. So as a definition, conservation biology is a scientific study of the phenomena that affect the maintenance, loss, and restoration of biodiversity. And so, yeah, a lot of ecologists end up going into conservation biology, either as researchers or as, more applied policy type people. Conservation then would be the preservation and restoration of biodiversity. So a lot of times this is focused on entire ecosystems and maximizing the number of species and that kind of thing. Although with the laws in the United States, the main law that affects conservation is, or one of the main laws is the Endangered Species Act, which is much more species focused, like focused on a single species and a single rare or threatened or endangered species that and so, yeah, there's all this funding coming from the federal government for protecting these endangered species. However, a lot of times what the ecologists end up doing is saying, okay, if we're going to protect this endangered species, we need to protect its habitat and all of the members of that community there. And so, yeah, that ends up kind of being, the endangered species kind of end up being umbrella species for all the other species in the habitats and that kind of thing. But yeah, there are some conservation positions which are more focused on things like biodiversity and figuring out, where should we, identifying particular habitats that are, perhaps have lots of rare species or lots of species diversity and that kind of thing, trying to obtain those from whoever owns them and set them aside for conservation purposes. Okay. And so, yeah, conservation biology is mostly, a field that's focused on understanding what's causing us to lose biodiversity and how can we control those problems. And as we mentioned in class last time, there are a number of causes of loss of biodiversity. The main things are changes in the habitat that humans are causing, so habitat destruction or conversion of one type of habitat to another, habitat degradation, and habitat fragmentation. So these are the most important causes of the loss of biodiversity. Extinction of species is they're just losing their habitats. There are these other problems that we mentioned as well: invasive species, overexploitation, pollution, and climate change. So I just kind of mentioned these last week, so I want to go into a little bit more detail about them now. But yeah, basically all of these things can lead to what's called an extinction vortex. So whenever a species, like its population size is reduced by one of these problems here, so we've got in this figure here, we've got habitat loss, pollution, overexploitation, exotic species, and that kind of thing, all contributing to smaller, more fragmented or isolated populations here. And clearly that's going to be increasing the extinction risk of these populations. Large populations have less extinction risk than small populations. But basically you can get positive feedback loops here in this kind of system where if any sort of problem with species abundance starts to take hold, then other problems start to become more severe as well. So for example, if one of these things is reducing population sizes, that leads to inbreeding, loss of genetic diversity, which leads to reduced genetic variation to deal with environmental change and that kind of thing, which really leads to lower survival and reproduction of individuals in the populations, which also reduces population size. And you can have all of these other things that reduced population size are more sensitive to, things like demographic stochasticity, environmental variation, and catastrophes, all contributing to more variation in population size, especially smaller population sizes. And so, yeah, it's kind of this vortex here, a tornado of problems that is driving a population to extinction. And clearly these factors, these human cause factors at the top here are very strongly affecting many populations and contributing to this extinction vortex. And so, yeah, one of the thrusts of conservation biology is trying to figure out how we can overcome these problems here at the top and minimize their impacts. When you have extinctions in communities, that can also lead to something called extinction cascades. One of the things that we've kind of emphasized here in this class is that in ecosystems, everything is connected to each other. There's all these connections. Many of them are indirect. But yeah, the species are all sort of intertwined in this web of interactions. And if you get the extinction of one population or one member of a community, then you're also losing all the connections that that species was involved in, and that can actually lead to other species going extinct as well. So, for example, if a like a large herbivore goes extinct, for example, as a result of overexploitation or habitat loss or something like that, then any of the predators that ate that large herbivore are also going to go extinct. And so you can basically get extinction cascades because of the fact that many of the species in a community are linked together with these interactions. So species extinctions, they are a natural process. So species go extinct naturally, as well as by these human-caused problems. And you can see here, so this graph is showing extinction rate in terms of families per million of years. So this is like the number of families that have gone extinct over time here on the x-axis. And you can see that extinction rate is highly variable here. There have been several peaks where we have what are called a mass extinction, where a lot of the diversity of life has gone extinct. In some cases, these mass extinctions resulted in upwards of 90% of species. These are fossil species, I should say, but 90% of known species going extinct and not appearing in the later fossil record. So yeah, these are huge events that affect the diversity, global diversity of life on Earth. These mass extinctions, and so far there have been five extinction events that are large enough to be called mass extinctions. And typically all of these mass extinctions have been caused by some sort of major change in the environment on Earth. So some major change in the climate, for example, driven by things like volcanic activity or plate tectonics causing, you know, the ocean currents to change and that kind of thing. But yeah, basically there's these mass extinctions typically caused by some huge disruptive event in the environment of Earth. Meteorite impacts, that's another big one, big cause of mass extinctions, probably the reason why the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. But yeah, you can see there's kind of this background extinction rate that's you know, fairly variable. It's going up and down here, and then there are these peaks called mass extinctions, where all of a sudden there's a high number of species going extinct, or a high number of families in this case. So basically we actually have estimates of extinction rates from the past based on the fossil record. And we can sort of get an idea of the rate of change. So how many species do we expect to lose per million years, for example, in a background extinction rate? How many are we losing? What's the rate of species lost during one of these mass extinction events and that kind of thing? And we can compare that to our current estimates of species loss. So we can also estimate extinction rates right now. What's the rate that we're losing species currently? And we actually think that we're currently in a sixth mass extinction. So the extinction rates that we're measuring now are similar to the rates that we would expect in one of these 5 previous mass extinction events. And so yeah, there are some people who argue that we are currently experiencing the 6th mass extinction on Earth. And this is the only one that's caused by mostly the activities of a single species, and that would be humans. So yeah, we're causing a bunch of major changes on Earth, and these changes aren't really unprecedented, but they are expected to affect global diversity pretty strongly. Okay, so yeah, we might be in a sixth mass extinction, and so yeah, a lot of the applications of ecology is trying to minimize this extinction rate, trying to maximize the amount of biodiversity that we can conserve and maintain on the planet. There is a lot of focus in terms of conservation biology. There's lots of focus on the tropics. We've learned that the tropics tend to have way more species than more temperate latitudes. And so it kind of makes sense if you're trying to maximize the global diversity to try to focus on tropical diversity because that's where the most of the species are. And so here's just a figure showing bird species richness on the terrestrial environments of Earth, and you can see it's much higher at the in the middle, around 0 degrees latitude, than in the more temperate areas. And so, yeah, some would argue that we should really try to conserve tropical ecosystems if we're interested in maintaining global biodiversity. Interestingly, it turns out that there's often a relationship between the like amount of resources a country has to set aside land for conservation and you know how long it's been developed, a developed country. So you've got these developing countries whose you know economy is just getting going, and those kinds of countries tend to be ones that are you know just starting to exploit the natural resources that are available to them in their country. They're just starting to do things like take advantage of their forest cover for you know harvesting it for wood and for paper and that kind of thing. Starting to mine their geologic riches as well. And yeah, so there's this relationship between how long a country has been developing economically and how much land is actually set aside for conservation. So here's just an article saying rich countries gain, poor countries lose forest cover. And so yeah, the richer developed countries, they basically have the resources to you know set aside some land to conserve biodiversity rather than just exploiting all the resources everywhere. And that kind of thing. So yeah, there's this relationship between economic development and conservation. And so yeah, given this, a lot of these tropical countries here where the diversity is the greatest, they're also they also tend to be developing countries, whose economy is just getting started, relatively poor countries that you know they haven't gotten this influx of economic value because they haven't really exploited their natural resources yet. Whereas in places like the U.S. and Europe, for example, we've been exploiting our natural resources for years and years. And so yeah, there's this kind of disjoint here between where the conservation value is and where the actual money for conservation is as well. And so I have a group discussion question here. Should developed countries try to prevent tropical deforestation? Do you think that developed countries should take an active role as being kind of global stewards and kind of, you know, providing money to these developing countries to set aside land for conservation? So I'd like you to discuss this kind of social issue in breakout rooms. So let me copy that question and put it in the chat. And yeah, I'll have you go into 2 breakout rooms to discuss this. All right, so you should be getting the invitation to join those breakout rooms now, and I'll post that question in the chat to everyone. discussion activity. All right, that is probably enough time. All right, it looks like everyone is back in the main room. Okay, so I'd like to hear what y'all came up with here. Do you think that developed countries should try to prevent tropical deforestation? And yeah, I guess you could maybe talk about how they might do that as well if you think they should. But yeah, does anyone want to say anything about this? You can either talk with your microphones or type in the chat. What do you think? Should developed countries try to help out these developing tropical countries and try to prevent tropical deforestation that is driving a lot of species extinct in those places that are the most diverse places on Earth? Anyone? All right, Aaron says, I think they should. Anyone else think they should? Does anyone think they shouldn't? Anna says they should, but it's a lot easier said than done when we have environmental issues of our own here. Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, should we spend our limited resources that we have to go into conservation? Should we be helping them, or should we be dealing with our own problems? That's certainly an issue. And I'm guessing that the current administration would say, well, they would probably say we shouldn't be dealing with any of these issues, but yeah, they certainly wouldn't be okay with us giving money to other countries probably to help deal with their issues. Yeah, so yeah, this is a complicated problem. The people who would argue that that developed countries shouldn't help these developing countries, these are the kind of people who would say, you know, some of the main reasons why developed countries have so much money is because they got to exploit all of their natural resources. So, for example, Europe used to be covered in forest; it was like completely forested, and you only got the development of Europe in terms of economic development after they cleared all the forest and you know started converting that habitat into other things. And so yeah, some people would argue we shouldn't interfere with these developing countries. They're exploiting their resources just like we did, and they should be able to do that to develop, you know, without foreign intervention and that kind of thing. But yeah, there are definitely people who argue that we should be helping them. I mean, if we're interested in preserving global biodiversity, certainly those the tropical areas are kind of hotspots of diversity, and so protecting them is important for maintaining the global biodiversity for sure. And so some of the ways that have been kind of put forward to try to help with that issue is things like donating money, so just giving money directly to the governments of these countries with the condition that it be used for conservation, for like setting aside land. In some cases, like paying people not to log. So a lot of this forest clearing is just people who live in the forest or live adjacent to the forest, and they actually need a source of income, need a source of food and everything. A lot of these are just subsistence farmers that are clearing forest and converting it into little gardens that they're basically just using to survive, to feed their families and themselves. And so yeah, by giving them a source of income from the government to just like say, okay, here's some money, don't clear your forest. That's one idea, and they can use that money then to buy food instead of growing their own food and that kind of thing. But yeah, those are just some ideas. Hopefully you can see here that it's a pretty complicated issue. It's often, these conservation issues are often kind of global issues, and they require kind of international cooperation and that kind of thing. But yeah, it can be pretty complicated. And even though the science is really clear here, like basically you have more diversity if you have fewer fewer of these problems that humans are causing, like habitat loss. So that's pretty simple, but in terms of actually applying that knowledge to actually prevent stuff from getting converted, habitats from getting converted, it's a complex social issue. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint here. All right, so now I just want to go back. So I mentioned some of these reasons that biodiversity is threatened. I want to just go back to that and talk a bit more about them in a little bit more detail. So again, the main reason that biodiversity is threatened is habitat loss, habitat conversion, habitat degradation. Basically, the species are going extinct because they're losing their habitat. They're losing the places where they live, and that's the main thing. But there were some other contributions to extinction as well. So let's talk about the others in a little bit more detail. So I mentioned invasive species and the fact that most exotic species, so most species that are introduced from other areas, actually don't cause any problems. So there's tons of exotic species that are happy just to live in people's gardens. They don't escape and become problems to the native species. So they're introduced, but they're not invasive. However, there are some invasive species that are particularly problematic, and they can kind of take over native ecosystems, outcompete native species, and contribute to the extinction of native species. And this kind of global mixing of species and kind of conversion or kind of spread of these invasive species to everywhere where they could possibly live is contributing to something called global homogenization. So this is like making all the communities on Earth more similar to each other than they would be otherwise. So a lot of times dispersal limitation is preventing species from getting to different areas and mixing. And so yeah, you have this beta diversity, this turnover as you're going from place to place in terms of the species composition that's caused by dispersal limitation. But when humans are moving species all around everywhere, you can get global homogenization happening where essentially you get the same sorts of species occurring everywhere across the globe. And it's not just moving species directly, it's also the fact that we tend to modify the environment in pretty similar ways everywhere humans are. We tend to do things like clear forests and make yards and that kind of thing. And so we're kind of making the environments across Earth more similar to each other. We're driving a lot of native species to extinction. We're moving species all around, causing these invasions. And all of these factors together are leading to this biotic homogenization. And so rather than getting a lot of turnover as you're going from place to place, instead you're seeing the same species as you're going from place to place for all of these different reasons. And so no one's really arguing that all of the species on Earth are going to go extinct. That's just not going to happen, at least while humans are still around. Like maybe humans would do something so much that we destroy all life on the planet, but there's always going to be something. As long as human society is persisting, you know, we do depend on other species, and so we at least need things like agricultural species, and there's going to be all these pest species and that kind of thing that persist. So yeah, we're not really worried that everything, all life is going to go extinct, but it is just kind of a shame to get this kind of McDonaldization of all the life on Earth, where so the analogy there is like whereas before you could visit other countries and try totally different kinds of food. All the restaurants would be completely different than anything you'd ever experienced before. But now you go to major cities and you see like KFC and McDonald's and stuff everywhere across the earth. And so yeah, a similar kind of process might be happening here with communities of species, where we're basically making these communities more similar across the earth. Okay, so yeah, that's invasive species. We also mentioned overexploitation. So this is like hunting or overfishing species to extinction. So right here, I'm showing you a comparison image of the same display board. So this is like a display board of a dock. So this is a recreational fishery in Key West, Florida. And on these docks, people go out, people who have their boats moored at these docks, they go out and they catch fish and they bring them back and they process them here on these docks. And they hang all the fish up here and take photos. And so this is pictures of the same display board from the same dock, the same recreational fishery, showing the largest trophy fish that were caught. And we have 1957 on the left and 2007 on the right. And yeah, you can basically see that even in this recreational fishery, which is typically not nearly as impactful as a commercial fishery, you've got a huge reduction in terms of the size of the fish that are being caught, and the species composition is turning more to these smaller fishes here, rather than these big game fish that were being caught in the 50s. So yeah, over exploitation is like hunting a species to extinction or overfishing, causing the population sizes of these species that are used as food to be or materials or anything like that to be going extinct. And it's especially problematic with fisheries. For whatever reason, maybe it's the fact that we're just better at catching fish than we are at exploiting other sorts of populations. But yeah, fish seem to be particularly susceptible to overexploitation, and there's been tons of examples of fisheries kind of collapsing as a result of overexploitation. And so some of the things that we can try to do to prevent overexploitation is basically just monitoring the population sizes of everything that we're harvesting, and trying to harvest sustainably. So there's all these models that people create for population change over time for all of these different species based on fisheries data that try to predict the kind of maximum number of individuals that we can remove from a population to have them still persist and be maintained in the environment as well. All right, so that is overexploitation. Pollution is another factor driving species to extinction. Again, tends to be particularly problematic in aquatic systems, mostly because aquatic systems are kind of draining all these pollutants from the land, and they get concentrated in water bodies. So here I'm showing you the Mississippi River drainage system and the distribution of cities and farms. Both cities and farms are actually contributing a lot to pollution and aquatic systems in these areas. Cities, you have basically runoff from impervious surfaces, which tends to also have things like oil from cars and any sort of fertilizers that people are using on their lawns and that kind of thing in it. The agricultural systems are also a source of things like pesticides and fertilizers getting into the water and then draining into these rivers. And yeah, it's mostly these nutrients, things like the fertilizers getting into these waters, causing blooms of algae, which leads to something called eutrophication. And so eutrophication is especially problematic here in the low order or high order parts of the Mississippi River, I should say, places where the river is collecting, tons of material from upstream and concentrating it in a smaller area. And so where the Mississippi River drains out into the Gulf of Mexico, you have really high levels of things like nitrates and phosphates, these chemicals used for fertilizers. It causes a bunch of algae to grow uncontrollably. The algae are fertilized by the fertilizer just like plants on land are. But rather than being kind of beneficial to these environments, instead these algal blooms become harmful because basically the algae kind of shade everything out. There's like the water becomes really cloudy, and light doesn't penetrate as far. A lot of these algae cells end up dying and sinking to the bottom, and through the process of decomposition, there's all these bacteria and things decomposing the bodies of the dead algae, or the cells of the dead algae. And that uses up the oxygen in the water. Decomposition is a process involving cellular respiration. And so yeah, you get low oxygen levels in these places with high amounts of algae which are dying. And that leads to something called dead zones. So the water becomes essentially toxic. The oxygen levels are so low that many species can't actually survive, and that leads to these fish kills. Basically, the ecosystem kind of collapses. You still have the algae and all the decomposers of the algae, but all of the larger animals that rely on dissolved oxygen in the water tend to collapse in these kinds of systems that are heavily polluted. So yeah, you can get pollution being a contributor to species loss as well. And finally, we have climate change. So climate change, I would say, is a relatively minor factor in terms of species extinctions. It's mostly affecting populations that basically have no way of moving, and so many species can actually can kind of move. So their thermal optimum is shifting northward as the climate warms, but they have some sort of dispersal mechanism, or their populations are large enough that basically climate change isn't driving many things extinct. Where it's a problem is where species can't move, either as a result of humans kind of fragmenting the habitat, causing dispersal limitation essentially, or species are like at the tops of mountains. They're sort of at the limit of where they could go. So you've got these sort of alpine species at the tops of mountains, and as the climate warms, they essentially have nowhere to go. They can't continue to move up. They're already at the tops of the mountains. So yeah, climate change is a contributor to global loss of biodiversity as well, but a relatively minor one, I would say. The effects of climate change are more going to be effects directly on humans. So things that are contributing to loss of ecosystem function, things that we're relying on. So yeah, let me talk a little bit more about climate change. I mentioned in terms of an application of ecology, studying the effects of climate change is another big one. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the evidence for climate change, just because we haven't really focused on it specifically yet in the class. So yeah, we know that climate change is driven by changes in the concentrations of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere through the greenhouse effect. We talked about that when we talked about climate early on in the semester. And yeah, with climate change, you get things like rapidly changing temperature, rainfall patterns change, and sea levels change as well as the climate warms. Water expands. That's a major contributor to sea level rise, is just the water expanding as it gets warmer. But also you get melting of glaciers, melting of ice that's currently being stored on land. And as that ice melts and flows into the oceans, you get sea level rise contributing to that as well. And yeah, I just want to reiterate that there is really good evidence that climate is warming. So global temperatures have risen about 1 degree Celsius since 1880, when good records of temperature across the globe started being kept. And yeah, here I'm showing you data for climate, for temperature over time. And we've got global temperature, land temperature, and ocean temperatures here graphed separately here. And you can see that all of them are increasing. And this is coming from direct measurement of temperatures. There is a lot of variability, as you might expect, for these temperature data. I mean, temperature varies a lot across the globe and across seasons and that kind of thing. So you do have to do a lot of averaging to get these kinds of changes, documented. But we're definitely seeing statistical significance here in terms of change in temperature over time. And yeah, it's increasing from all of these different sorts of data that we're gathering here. Some other evidence, so other than just directly measuring temperature, there's also other, I would say even more irrefutable evidence that the climate is warming. One of the biggest ones is melting glaciers and ice caps. So it's pretty obvious to see from things like satellite imagery and even just imagery showing the extent of glaciers and that kind of thing, that these ice sources, these ice that's stored on land, are getting smaller. And so here I'm showing you shrinking ice caps based on satellite imagery here. So this is the perennial ice cover, the ice cover that tends to be found, the extent of ice cover that tends to be found year after year on the Earth. And we've got 1980 compared to 2000 compared to 2011. And yeah, you can basically see that these ice caps, at least this northern ice cap, is shrinking. Southern one is shrinking as well. You can do the same thing in the south there. Here are some pretty striking images of glaciers which are melting. And so we've got this Muir Glacier in Alaska. Both of these photos were taken in August, sort of mid to late August. One of them was taken in 1941. It's the one on the left here. And you can see just how large that glacier is, kind of filling this entire valley with ice. The same glacier in 2004, you can see that, yeah, the extent of the glacier, the extent of the ice is much less. It's kind of withdrawn way back into this valley here. So yeah, we've lost a lot of the ice volume here in this glacier. Again, evidence, pretty irrefutable evidence that the climate is warming. And then we have sea level rise as well. We actually can get really accurate measurements of sea level rise based on satellites. So satellites can essentially send a laser down and get really accurate measurements of the distance between the satellite and the Earth. And we can measure how much the water is rising using this satellite data. And there's been actually 3 inches of sea level rise since 1990. It's happening pretty fast. And just to show you, so the predictions are that sea level might rise 6 to 7 feet in 100 to 300 years. So just to see how that will affect the globe, here I've got the city of Boston, a coastal city in the US here. And this is what the extent of land looked like in 2016. What would happen if sea level rose 2 feet? Basically, it would flood this amount of area. And so, yeah, we would basically lose these parts of Boston. If it rose 3 feet, we'd lose this much. if it rose 6 to 7 feet, again, as predicted in the next 100 to 300 years, this is what Boston would look like. You could see a lot of it would basically be underwater. And so yeah, sea level rise, pretty big problem. A lot of major global cities are coastal cities, and so this is a problem that's going to have some pretty dramatic consequences if you know, if the models pan out and we get this amount of sea level rise that's predicted. So other evidence that climate is changing, it basically affects the ranges and the phenology of organisms. So all of these organisms are obviously responding to climate change. Some of them are responding by shifting ranges. As I mentioned, many of them are shifting to cooler latitudes, so shifting away from the tropics to more temperate latitudes. Also shifting phenology. So phenology is referring to the timing of important events in the sort of natural history of organisms. So this would be like the timing of flowering of plants or of setting fruit, the timing of arrival for migratory species and departure. Those are phenology, kind of seasonality of species and what they're doing. And yeah, here's some data for various marine ecosystem or marine taxa here across the bottom. We've got benthic algae, we've got some mollusks, some jellyfish, and all these different marine invertebrates, as well as some vertebrates and fishes and seabirds and everything. And we're looking at global responses to climate change across these different taxa. We've got distribution change here in this figure A. And in this case, they were focused on northern hemisphere species. And so all of these different taxa, you can see that most of them are tending to shift their ranges to be found in more cooler climates. So they basically have shifted northward. It looks like on average about, so all taxa here is this last column here. They've shifted about 20 kilometers northward here on average. And in the bottom here, we're showing phenology change. So this is sort of timing of the events, as I mentioned. In this case, it would be mostly timing of like population spikes, I'm guessing here for these marine invertebrates. But yeah, you can basically see that they've shifted the timing of these events in the life cycle of these organisms have shifted earlier, perhaps as a result of climate change as well. The optimal conditions for their outbreaks or whatever are likely occurring earlier in the season when the climate is still a little bit cooler, just as a result of seasonal changes in the climate. All right, so the ranges and phenology, these shifts in the ranges and phenology of species are further evidence of climate change. And we see similar things on land, so things like plants flowering earlier, migratory species arriving earlier, things shifting their distributions northward, and that kind of thing. All right, another effect of climate change that we're seeing is the shift of tropical species coming into temperate areas, and Texas is kind of right at that, right at the forefront of this change in species composition. And here I'm focusing on especially tropical diseases. So this is a particular set of species that are important for human populations or human society. Are these tropical diseases, and their current distributions are shifting northward into Texas from the tropics. And so yeah, there's this paper here called "The Rise of Neglected Tropical Diseases in the New Texas." And yeah, there's basically all of these diseases that used to be more found in the tropical latitudes that are spreading into Texas, probably as a result of climate change affecting, you know, the abiotic conditions, the places where they could actually occur. So yeah, things like Chagas, dengue, Zika, chikungunya, murine typhus. All of these things are increasing in frequency. Like we're finding more cases of these tropical diseases over time, probably again as a result of climate change, shifting the ranges northward. Okay, so that's it for kinds of these effects of human activities on biodiversity that I wanted to summarize there. Are there any questions? So the next thing we're going to do is take a Menti quiz, as you're seeing here. Are there any questions about any of the stuff we've talked about so far? So far we've talked about like applications of ecology and jobs in ecology. We've reviewed some of these effects of humans on biodiversity with a particular emphasis on climate change. And we also talked about conservation biology specifically as kind of the field that's dealing with mitigating these changes these human-caused extinctions in the environment. Any questions on that stuff before we take this Menti quiz? Okay, looks like not. So let me stop this share, pull up the Menti quiz, and then share that screen. All right, so the code is 174503. You should be able to pull up another window if you're on a computer on menti.com and use this code to join. All right, that looks like all the students, so everyone except for me and Carolyn is probably joined. All right, let's go ahead and start. Which island is expected to have the lowest diversity? So this is based on island biogeography. All right, everyone got it. Small island far from the mainland. Very good. All right, who's winning so far? Looks like it's Hannah. Very good, Hannah. Okay, next question. Which of these coexistence hypotheses allows species to coexist even in the absence of perturbation? So this is saying which of these hypotheses would allow competitors to coexist in an equilibrium, which is an equilibrium hypothesis. Yeah, it's going to be the niche partitioning. This is an evolutionary force is driving competitors to have lower overlap in their resource use, which would allow them to coexist kind of indefinitely, not dependent on any sort of change. All of these others, the lottery model, temporal variability, and spatial coexistence all rely on some sort of change in the environment, allowing less competitive species to coexist with more competitive species. Okay. Let's see. Looks like Hannah's doing really well. All right, next question. Which of these hypotheses about diversity function relationships posits that the identity of high functioning species might change over time? Yeah, that was the portfolio effect. So yeah, portfolio effects are when essentially you benefit by having a big portfolio of species to choose from, particularly in cases where the environment is changing, because the identity of high functioning species might change over time or over multiple functions. That was another sort of way you could get portfolio effects. Okay. Which factor is the strongest driver of biodiversity loss on land? All right, it is going to be habitat loss and alteration. The other problems are definitely problems, but they're more of a problem in the water in the case of overexploitation and pollution, or they're just not as big of a problem in the case of climate change. Okay, that was the last question. Looks like Hannah's going to take it. Excellent job. Okay, let us go back to the other PowerPoint. Share screen, PowerPoint. Okay, so yeah, we have climate change as kind of an issue here. We were just talking about that. So just a little bit about what are some of the things that we can do to try to prevent climate change. A big thing was to try to make a carbon budget. So try to create this system of like an international agreement that that limits the amount of fossil fuels that you could burn and the amount of carbon dioxide that you could release into the atmosphere. And this kind of came to a head in 2015 with the Paris Climate Conference, when 195 countries adopted the first ever universal legally binding global climate deal, where it's like you can only emit this much carbon to try to prevent climate change. And the goal was to limit the increase of global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius. And that was based on this idea that they were going to reduce emissions, and there would be a peak in the emissions as soon as possible, and everyone should start reducing the amount of carbon dioxide they're emitting, and try to reduce the emissions as much as possible over the next few decades. Unfortunately, the current administration, as it was famously reported, pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Conference. But yeah, the idea was that we have this carbon budget, and in terms of global carbon budget, so there's basically a certain amount of carbon that that human society can emit that would result in 2 degrees of climate warming. And so yeah, with the start of the industrial era here, I'm showing you this kind of hourglass image showing the carbon budget for 2 degrees of warming. Since the Industrial Revolution, by 2011, we had already emitted about half of the carbon that we have in our carbon budget to only have 2 degrees of climate warming. So yeah, kind of scary numbers here. But yeah, basically reducing carbon emissions is the main way to fight climate change. Here we have some models showing different population growth scenarios, and yeah, the main thing that's contributing to carbon emissions is increases in carbon emissions is just the increase in the number of humans on Earth. And there's data here. Different models show different things in terms of what might happen to human population sizes over time. But yeah, clearly all of the problems associated with loss of biodiversity are exacerbated by having more humans. So hopefully we're in one of the less intense population growth scenarios. There is a lot of evidence that human populations might be slowing down a little bit now. They've been increasing like faster than exponential, like accelerating growth rates for a long time now. but that's just starting to level off, I think. All right, and I just wanted to end the course, you know, thinking about how you as an individual might you know, benefit human society, benefit global biodiversity, and some of the you know, your individual behaviors. And here's just a quote that I like from Rachel Carson, a famous a writer who basically started the environmental movement in the 1960s. But she says, the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we will have for destruction. All right, so just to end the class here, I've got this other kind of inspirational video. You might have seen it. It was actually an ad for a David Attenborough documentary, but it's just kind of inspiring. Like, what do we have to lose here in the case of biodiversity? So let me make sure that it's sharing the right thing with you here and that it's sharing the sound.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright, blessed days, dark, sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colours of a rainbow, so pretty in the sky, also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Quite simply wonderful.
All right, so yeah, pretty nice video, I think. Let's see, where'd my Zoom go? Okay. Okay, so just to finish up here, I have one last discussion question. I think that we don't have enough time to actually talk about it here. But yeah, the discussion question was, what can society do to help, and what can you as an individual do to help solve some of these big questions in conservation? So yeah, what can society do? Basically, we can pass laws with effective regulations on these environmental issues. Study the problems to better understand them and understand solutions, possible solutions to them. And develop effective educational and outreach programs just to make sure that our human populations are, you know, understanding of these problems and, you know, what's at stake here. What can you as an informed individual do to help? So you've taken this ecology class, and now that now you understand the concepts, hopefully, much better than the average person. So yeah, what can you as an individual do to help? Vote, be informed, like keep up with this literature as it's developing here. Be mindful of your own energy usage, so try to minimize your energy use. And then communicate with science skeptics. So, you know, I don't want you to get in rows with your family, your conservative family members, but you can certainly try to change some minds if they're open to it, based on real data that we've hopefully imparted to you with this class here. All right, so that's it for the ecology class. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful to you. Certainly good luck going forward. Good luck with the exam on Thursday. And good luck with the rest of your careers here. I'm sorry that this pandemic has kind of damped the exciting atmosphere at the end of the semester. And if you're graduating this year, I'm really sorry for you that you don't get your graduation. You also are getting put into a job market that's pretty bad right now. But yeah, hopefully you had fun. I had fun teaching y'all. Your exam, the second part of exam 3 is going to be on Thursday. It'll work just like exam 3A did. It'll be 25 multiple choice questions plus a bonus on Canvas, scheduled for our normal class time on Thursday, so 2 to 3:15 p.m. And the topics are communities, community dynamics, biogeography, biodiversity, and applied ecology. Any questions before we break? All right, it looks like not. If you have any questions that you want to ask me, certainly send me an email. I can answer you over email. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. It was a great semester for me too. And thanks everyone else. Yeah, it's been fun. And yeah, have a good rest of your semester, finishing out all your exams. Definitely let me know if you want any advice for me about ecology jobs or applying for grad school or anything like that. If you need recommendations, I'd be happy to help with that as well. But yeah, good luck with everything. And yeah, have a good rest of your life, I guess. Bye.